Have you ever had a problem with your 03 to 06 Chevy full-size truck? Silverado, Suburban, Tahoe, Avalanche, even the GMC Yukon, Sierras, and the Cadillac Escalades. You have a moment where there's that one gauge that starts reading inaccurately. And usually what that means, well, actually other symptoms can happen as well. Sometimes the whole gauge tends to freeze up, or the reading is thrown completely off. What you might have is a stepper motor that's on its way out. What a stepper motor is, it's basically a little electronic motor behind the instrument cluster that actually works the needle. And as you can see, my tachometer is reading a bit inaccurate. You'll actually see it once I'm completely stopped. So basically, here's what I'm talking about. As you can see, I'm at a stoplight at idle, and my tachometer is reading like 200 RPMs. Usually my truck idles at about 500 RPMs. But because of that, I'm getting a feeling that the stepper motor in the tachometer is starting to go bad, and it throws the reading, depending on how it's feeling, it throws the reading off by about 300, 400, or 500 RPMs, and sometimes on a good day it works perfectly. So basically, I'm come to a conclusion that this stepper motor is slowly starting to go bad and needs to be replaced. And that's not an easy thing to do. Well, at least it is for those of you who know how to use a soldering iron, because the stepper motors are actually held in by solders, and those have to be replaced and resoldered with new stepper motors. And now usually sometimes when a gauge is getting an inaccurate reading, usually that's a sign that it's going bad. Usually that doesn't raise the red flag for most owners of these trucks. What really raises the red flag is when the gauge completely freezes up and won't go forwards, won't go back. And usually the gauge that throws the red flag is either the speedometer, the fuel gauge, maybe the temperature gauge or the oil pressure, and the tachometer as well is what makes people wake up and realize that, hey, this cluster needs to be fixed. The voltmeter gauge probably won't do it for them, because you already got a voltmeter indicator in the dash, so some people don't see a point for a voltmeter gauge to be set right there. But anyway, yeah, that I like to have that function too. So basically, usually what most people recommend when one stepper motor goes bad, you can just replace that one and your whole cluster will work again, but eventually the other stepper motors that were original to your cluster will eventually go bad, so it's always a good idea to just replace them all while you have the chance. And so that's basically what I'm going to do. And which kind of sucks, because if you've seen my previous videos, I've already upgraded the gauge bezel of this and replaced the needles, and now I got to take the whole cluster out again to repair the thing. So I'll show you what exactly I'm going to do as far as upgrades. Usually this problem mostly occurs on startup. See, when you turn it on, all the gauges light up as normal, but when you start the vehicle, after it's finished starting up, the whole cluster resets itself. All the gauges will fall to their lowest readings, and then normally they should pick back up, but the tachometer usually doesn't read right. Let me see if I can replicate the problem. Oh, there. Now it just fixed itself. Now it's idling normal. or it's reading normal, I should say. The truck idles fine, runs perfectly. You see, when you turn the cluster off, everything falls back down. Let me see if it'll do it again. Usually it happens when the truck's been sitting for a while. Okay, let me see if we can do it one more time. Well, you guys kind of get the idea. Normally what happens is usually as it's powering up, it usually falls below the 1 mark. And when it's at its worst reading, sometimes when I'm idling at 500 RPMs, it'll point at 0 like it thinks the engine stalled. So what I'm gonna have to do now is pull apart the whole cluster and send it off to go get repaired. Or if you know how to use a soldering iron, you could actually perform this job yourself. All right, now that the cluster is pulled back out again, here's what I'm gonna be upgrading it to. See, here's the new gauge face. This is a legit Escalade gauge face that was actually pulled out of a junkyard Escalade. I actually got this on eBay for 40 bucks. It's actually much cheaper just getting the face than just getting that full US Speedo kit that usually most people like to do. In which I wanted to make my own custom cluster by doing these custom chrome 07 Escalade style needles with the red pointers. You can see they're chrome to match the actual Escalade gauge bezel. Since I already had the Escalade bezel, why not do the Escalade face along with it? And as you will also see right here, this is for a trans temp gauge, which mine doesn't have. You can add the trans temp to these clusters, but the only thing is you will have to solder in the 7th stepper motor, which actually the rebuild kit I got actually came with all 7 stepper motors. Usually mine only has 6, but since I bought one with 7, why not take the time and effort, add that 7th gauge needle and get me a trans temp gauge. And while I'm doing that, I will also in the process be upgrading the backlighting in there to white LEDs. I decided to do that as well because there's all halogen LEDs in there. They seemingly appear to glow white, but that's usually from the blue film lay behind the gauge face that makes the yellow halogen bulbs appear to look blue. See, watch, if I put the Escalade cluster in the light, you will see how the back of it actually has a blue film over it that makes the instrument cluster look white, even though it's running halogen bulbs in the cluster. So basically what I'm going to start doing now is just tearing this apart and sending it off to get it repaired. Alright, now that we're back, we kind of lost a little bit of daylight, but I'm back to working on my instrument cluster. Just finished putting in the brand new stepper motors and even one for the transmission temperature. And I'm in the process of putting the needles in the cluster and trying to get everything adjusted. And one easy way I found to do this is while you're cycling your key on and off, you turn it on, there's everything all lit up. Just slightly turn the key between on and start, and you see all the needles will move down, because once you're trying to adjust the needles, while the cluster is off, the needles will move every which way they want. So you keep wanting to try this method. Each needle individually you put in when pretty much eventually they will all read correctly. When you turn it off, they will go right into their correct resting position. Everything seems right. Let's go ahead and check the function one last time. Bump it. So see, the needles will slowly work backwards past the rest position. That's what happens when the engine starts up. Well, now that everything, to my eyes, seems dead on the money, let's go ahead and put the gauge face back on and test everything out when we're finished. Alright, now that I've gotten everything put back together, the dash, the shifters back up, steering columns back to my position, the gauge bezel slid right in place, and now looking at it, if you didn't know this truck any better, you would have guessed I pulled this whole cluster out of a junkyard Escalade, with the exception of these aftermarket needles. But in reality, this is the original numbers matching cluster. So now let's go ahead and test all the functions. All the needles are coming up as they should. Let's give this thing a start and see how everything else works. Well, the tack seems dead on the money. So anyway, now let's go ahead and take this thing for a drive. I'm actually going to go by the gas station and fill this thing to make sure that the fuel gauge goes to full or shaded, or because unshaded is obviously empty. I'm gonna have to get used to that fuel gauge reading now. Anyway, let's go ahead and release the parking brake. It's just so the truck didn't roll when I put it down into gear just to move it in the driveway. I felt it inch, so that's why in the driveway, so that's why I kind of set the parking brake. Sorry, I'm talking like Jeff Boomhauer, but anyway, now let's go ahead and take this thing on a drive. All right, decided to turn my flash off for a quick second there. So also give a little bit of an idea on how these gauges look at night. This is still the stock lighting though, although I didn't get the replacement bulb for around the trans temp. At least we know the speedometer is working. The tack doesn't seem to be dipping below 500 RPMs. Well, we'll see how it works when I come to a dead stop. There, 500 RPMs. Perfect. Well, here we are at my local gas station. It's just directly across from my subdivision. So now I'm going to go ahead and refuel this whole thing and go ahead and get back to you when I'm on a full tank. All right, the tank's refueled. That gauge should go all the way to its maximum reading. Just like that. The tach is working perfectly now. The oil pressure gauge, I am going to have to fix one of these days. It's actually, if anyone noticed how it jumped all the way to its max reading when I didn't even start the truck, this truck doesn't really have run at 80 psi of oil pressure. It'd be amazing if they did. A little bit high, but at least we know we aren't lacking on oil pressure. But the main reason why it does that, even when the engine is not running, is because the oil pressure sending unit is bad. And that's literally on the engine all the way in the back. I mean, obviously, because that's where the oil pump is mounted. That sensor can tend to go bad on some of these trucks, at least the ones with the 4.8 like this one, the 5.3, or even the 6 liters. Yeah, whenever that goes bad, sometimes you get either max oil pressure or no oil pressure at all. If it gets no oil pressure, it will trigger a code and say oil pressure low down in the center display. But anyway, that's just a very simple fix. I've just neglected to actually get the motivation to go under the hood and actually locate the old sensor, replace it with the new one. I have the new one. I just lack motivation and just need to get that done in time. Everything seems to be in a comfortable and accurate operating parameters. That's a good sign. I didn't see that trans temp gauge move up any bit, but from what I read on the forums and all the stuff I had, turns out I found out that's probably due to the programming of the cluster, how it wasn't designed to have a trans temp gauge from the factory, but it's already added in. You will have to take it to your local dealer or any other places that specializes in GM vehicles to reprogram the cluster just to get the trans temp gauge working. But that's not a big deal for me, at least just for now. It's a good gauge just for show, so that there's just not a blank there. But anyway, hope you've enjoyed this cluster repair and kind of guess re-upgrade, I guess you could probably say. Hope this video was helpful for you. Don't forget to like, rate, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.